It wasn't that I didn't notice the changes. I did. Emily's mood swings, her sudden late nights, and her phone always turned face down on the table were impossible to ignore. I just didn't want to admit what they might mean. I had convinced myself that our marriage was solid, built on trust and love. We had a beautiful home, shared laughter over wine-filled evenings, and planned weekend getaways. It felt perfect, or so I thought. I brushed off her distance as stress. Emily had always been ambitious, working hard to climb the corporate ladder, so I figured her curt responses and distracted looks were just the result of a demanding schedule. Besides, I had my own work as the CEO of a successful firm. Long hours and intense board meetings often left me with little energy to dwell on things. But in the quiet moments, when I'd catch her staring at her phone with a faint smile or hear her excuse herself to take a work call, a knot would form in my stomach. Something was off, and deep down, I knew it. That morning started like any other. I kissed Emily on the cheek as she sipped her coffee, her eyes barely leaving her phone. "Have a good day," I said, and she responded with a vague "you too." I left for the office, shaking off the unease. My focus shifted to the day's agenda: meetings with investors, project updates, and strategic planning for the upcoming quarter. I was determined to stay on top of everything, to keep my mind occupied. Around mid-morning, my assistant knocked on my office door. "Mr. Lawson," she said, her tone hesitant, "there's someone here to see you." I glanced at my calendar. No appointments were scheduled. "Who is it?" "Luke Foster," she replied, her expression unreadable. I frowned. Luke was a mid-level manager in a different department. I had barely interacted with him beyond the occasional company-wide meeting. What could he possibly need from me? "Send him in," I said, curiosity outweighing my irritation. The door opened, and Luke strolled in with the kind of confidence that made my skin crawl. He was younger than me by at least a decade, his suit a little too flashy, his grin a little too smug. Without waiting for an invitation, he tossed a folder onto my desk and leaned back in the chair opposite me. "Morning, Caleb," he said, his tone casual to the point of disrespect. I stared at him, my patience already wearing thin. "What's this?" I asked, gesturing to the folder. He grinned wider. "Your termination letter," he said, leaning back as though he was savoring the moment. My heart skipped a beat. "Excuse me?" Luke's grin didn't falter. "Effective immediately, I'll be taking over as CEO." For a moment, I was too stunned to respond. My mind raced, trying to piece together how this could even be possible. Before I could ask the dozens of questions swirling in my mind, he added, "Oh, and Emily sends her regards." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I froze, the meaning behind them sinking in like a lead weight. Luke didn't just mean she was aware of this. He meant she was involved. 1,000 thoughts raced through my mind. The late-night texts, the work dinners, her sudden disinterest in our life together. It all made sense now. I forced myself to remain calm, my expression unreadable as I stared at the man who was reveling in my downfall. Inside, my world was crumbling, but I wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing it. "Is that all?" I asked, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. Luke looked taken aback by my lack of reaction. "I figured you'd have more to say," he said, narrowing his eyes. "Oh, I have plenty to say," I replied, standing and walking to the window. I needed to distance myself from him, to think, but I prefer to act. "You'll hear from me soon enough." His smug grin faltered for the first time. "Good luck with that," he said, rising from the chair. "You're out, Caleb. Accept it." As he walked out, I turned back to my desk and picked up the folder he had left behind. My hands trembled as I flipped through it, the official seal of the board glaring back at me. But then, I remembered something, a file tucked away in my safe at home. A file that could change everything. I set the folder down, my resolve hardening. Luke and Emily thought they'd won, but they had no idea what they were up against. The hours following Luke's visit were a blur of anger and disbelief. I sat in my office, staring at the termination letter he'd so smugly tossed onto my desk, trying to wrap my head around the audacity of it all. It wasn't just the shock of being ousted. It was the betrayal. Emily, my wife, the woman I had built a life with. She had sent Luke with a message meant to humiliate me. My phone buzzed on the desk, pulling me out of my thoughts. For a fleeting moment, I thought it might be her, but when I glanced at the screen, it was a text from one of the board members. Heard about the transition. Strange how quickly it happened. Let me know if you need anything. Strange. That word echoed in my mind as I pieced together what I knew. Luke couldn't have orchestrated this alone. The suddenness of the decision, the timing of the termination, it reeked of something deeper. And then there was Emily. Luke sends his regards. Those words played on repeat, each time fueling the fire in my chest. Before I could dig any deeper, my assistant knocked softly on the door and peeked in. Mr. Lawson? I looked up, trying to mask the turmoil brewing inside me. What is it? There's someone else here to see you. Her hesitation was palpable. Who? Luke Foster, she said reluctantly, her eyes darting to the floor. I felt a fresh wave of anger rise. Send him in, I said, my voice calm but sharp enough to make her flinch. Luke swaggered into my office like he owned the place, his confidence almost laughable. This time, he wasn't carrying a folder, just his phone, which he held loosely in his hand. Caleb, he said, flashing that infuriating grin. I thought we could chat. Clear the air. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. You've got 5 minutes. He laughed, as though amused by my resistance. Still trying to hold onto the reins, huh? I respect that. I didn't respond, letting the silence stretch. Luke shifted slightly, his smirk faltering as he realized I wasn't going to engage. Fine, he said, dropping the pretense. I'll get to the point. You're out. The board voted unanimously. Effective immediately, I'm the new CEO. It's nothing personal, it's just business. I raised an eyebrow. Business? Is that what you call sneaking behind my back and orchestrating a coup? He shrugged, unapologetic. Call it what you want. The bottom line is, the company needs fresh leadership, and the board agreed I was the right choice. I studied him for a moment, my mind racing. He was too cocky, too sure of himself. People like Luke didn't act alone. They needed allies, enablers. As if reading my thoughts, he added, and Emily agrees. She's been a great support through this transition. There it was. The confirmation I didn't want but had been expecting. Emily wasn't just complicit. She was an active participant. Luke leaned forward, resting his elbows on my desk. I know this is a lot to take in, but you're a smart guy. You'll land on your feet. Maybe take some time to travel, reinvent yourself. Emily and I can hold things down here. I stared at him, fighting the urge to lunge across the desk. Emily and you, I repeated, my voice dangerously calm. He nodded, his grin widening. She's amazing, isn't she? You're lucky to have had her as long as you did. That was it. The last straw. I stood abruptly, towering over him. Get out, I said, my voice low but laced with authority. Luke blinked, clearly caught off guard. What? You heard me, I said, pointing to the door. Get out of my office. If you want to play CEO, go play in your own space. This is still mine. He hesitated, as if deciding whether to push back, but something in my tone must have unnerved him. He stood slowly, straightening his tie. You'll regret this attitude, he said, trying to regain his composure. I was offering you a chance to leave with dignity. I let out a bitter laugh. Dignity? Coming from you? Don't make me laugh, Luke. This isn't over. Not by a long shot. He left without another word, the door clicking shut behind him. I sat back down, my mind racing. This wasn't just about my career or my marriage. It was about the betrayal, the audacity of people I had trusted to conspire against me. I opened the drawer of my desk, pulling out the key to my safe. If Luke thought he could walk in here and take everything from me, he was sorely mistaken. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. I spent the rest of the day in my office, pretending to work but really just staring at the termination letter Luke had so smugly delivered. The words blurred together after a while, the sting of betrayal growing sharper with every passing minute. Emily and Luke, two people I had trusted, albeit in very different ways, had orchestrated this entire thing. They thought they'd won, that I was out of moves. But they had no idea what I still had up my sleeve. When the office cleared out for the evening, I locked my door and went to the safe tucked behind the painting on the wall. I carefully entered the code, the sound of the lock clicking open echoing in the silent room. Inside was the file I had been preparing for months. Months ago, I had started noticing irregularities in the company's financial reports. Small discrepancies at first, unaccounted for expenses, vague invoices, but enough to make me suspicious. I'd hired a private investigator to look into it, and the file I now held in my hands was the result. It contained everything: fraudulent transactions, off-the-books payments, and a clear paper trail leading directly to Luke. I sat down at my desk, flipping through the pages. The more I read, the calmer I became. Luke had been siphoning company funds for personal gain, funding his flashy lifestyle and padding his offshore accounts. He had made one critical mistake, though. He'd underestimated me. But this wasn't just about Luke anymore. Emily's betrayal cut deeper than I wanted to admit. Her late nights, the secretive phone calls, the growing distance between us. It all made sense now. She hadn't just been complicit in this scheme. She had been an active participant. I thought back to the times I had stayed late at the office, working to provide the life she always said she wanted. The vacations, the house, the parties, it had all been for us. Or so I thought. Now, it was clear it had never been about us. It was about her. The next morning, I walked into the office with a renewed sense of purpose. Luke might have been celebrating his victory, but he had no idea the storm that was about to hit him. I started by scheduling a private meeting with the board of directors for later in the week. They needed to see what I had uncovered, and I wanted to make sure my presentation left no room for doubt. Luke had managed to manipulate them once, but I wouldn't let him do it again. For the time being, though, I had to keep up appearances. Luke swaggered through the halls, acting like he owned the place, but I didn't let it rattle me. When he passed by my office, I gave him a polite nod, which seemed to confuse him. "Still here, Caleb?" he asked, leaning casually against the doorframe. "For now," I said evenly, gesturing to the pile of papers on my desk, "just tying up some loose ends." He smirked, clearly enjoying what he thought was my defeat. "Good to see you taking this so well," he said. "Some people might have caused a scene, but you've handled it with dignity." I resisted the urge to laugh. "Well, Luke, I've always believed in letting my actions speak for themselves." He hesitated for a moment, as if sensing something beneath my calm demeanor, but then shrugged and walked away. As soon as he was gone, I closed my office door and began finalizing my plan. The next few days were a blur of meetings, calls, and late nights reviewing documents. Every detail had to be perfect. In the evenings, I went home to an empty house. Emily had started staying out late again, claiming she was meeting with clients or catching up with old friends. I didn't confront her, not yet. Confrontation would come, but on my terms. Instead, I spent those nights going through my home office, gathering more evidence. I even reviewed the footage from the security cameras I had installed months ago, cameras Emily didn't know about. What I found was exactly what I had expected, but still devastating to see. There she was, laughing with Luke, her hand resting on his arm in a way that was far too familiar. They had been meeting at our home, using the space I had worked so hard to provide as their personal playground. The anger burned hot, but I kept it in check. I couldn't afford to let my emotions take over. This wasn't about revenge, it was about justice. By the time my meeting with the board rolled around, I was ready. Luke thought he was untouchable, and Emily believed she had secured her future. But they were both about to learn a hard lesson. I wasn't the kind of man you could betray and walk away from unscathed. As I walked into the boardroom that morning, the weight of the file in my briefcase felt lighter than it had all week. I was ready to set the record straight, to expose the lies and deceit for what they were. The calm before the storm was over. The boardroom was quiet, the only sound the soft shuffle of papers as the directors reviewed the agenda for the meeting. I had spent countless hours preparing for this moment, ensuring that every detail of my presentation was airtight. I wasn't just here to clear my name. I was here to dismantle Luke's web of lies and deceit piece by piece. Luke entered the room a few minutes after me, all swagger and arrogance. He was dressed in a sharp suit, his grin a little too wide, as though he thought he was untouchable. Emily wasn't with him, but her shadow hung over the room, a reminder of how deep the betrayal ran. "Caleb," Luke said, taking the seat at the head of the table, the one that had been mine until just days ago. "Glad you could join us." I didn't respond, instead placing my briefcase on the table and methodically opening it. Inside was the file that contained everything I needed to expose him. I could feel the tension in the room rise as the other board members watched me with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. "Let's get started," Luke said, his tone dripping with condescension. "We've got a lot to cover today, and I wouldn't want to waste anyone's time." I stood, holding the file in my hands. "I agree," I said, my voice calm but firm. "Which is why I've prepared a presentation that I believe will clarify a few things for everyone here." Luke's grin faltered slightly, but he quickly recovered. "A presentation? Caleb, this isn't the time for—" I cut him off by placing the file on the table in front of him. "You'll want to see this, Luke. I guarantee it." The room fell silent as Luke hesitated, his hand hovering over the file. Finally, he opened it, his confidence slipping as he flipped through the pages. "What is this?" he asked, his voice lacking its usual smugness. "It's everything," I said, leaning forward. "Every fraudulent transaction, every shady deal, every cent you've embezzled from this company. It's all there, Luke, and it's irrefutable." The color drained from his face as he continued reading. The other board members leaned in, their curiosity turning to alarm as they glimpsed the documents. "Caleb," one of them said, their voice tight with concern, "are you saying that Luke has been stealing from the company?" "Yes," I said, cutting them off. "And not just small amounts either. We're talking millions of dollars over the past 2 years. He used company funds to bankroll his personal lifestyle, luxury cars, extravagant vacations, and even gifts for certain acquaintances." I let the implication hang in the air, knowing that everyone in the room would understand who I was referring to. Luke stammered, his usual bravado completely gone. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice shaking. "You can't prove any of this." I smiled, reaching into my briefcase and pulling out a USB drive. "Actually, I can. This contains copies of every transaction, every email, and every record that ties you to the fraud. And if that's not enough, I also have footage from the security cameras in my office, footage that shows you accessing files and accounts you had no authorization to touch." The boardroom erupted into chaos, voices overlapping as the directors demanded answers. Luke sat frozen, his face pale and his hands trembling. "This is a serious accusation," one of the board members said, their tone urgent. "If what Caleb is saying is true, we have a major problem on our hands." I nodded, "Which is why I'm proposing an immediate internal audit. If the audit confirms what I've presented, I'll be filing a formal complaint with the authorities." Luke finally found his voice, though it was weaker than before. "You're bluffing," he said, his eyes darting around the room. "You don't have anything. This is just a desperate attempt to save your position." I met his gaze, my expression cold. "Feel free to test that theory, Luke, but I'd suggest getting a good lawyer. You're going to need one." The room fell silent again, the weight of my words settling over everyone present. "Caleb," one of the senior board members said, their tone cautious, "if what you're saying is true, we owe you an apology. We were misled." "Misled?" I repeated, my voice sharp. "You weren't misled. You were manipulated by a man who saw an opportunity to enrich himself at this company's expense, and you let him." The board member looked away, their expression grim. As the meeting adjourned, Luke was escorted out of the room by security, his protests falling on deaf ears. I stayed behind, watching as the board members exchanged uneasy glances. One of them approached me as the room emptied. "What happens now?" they asked. "Now," I said, picking up my briefcase, "we clean up the mess." I left the boardroom with a sense of satisfaction, knowing that the tide had turned. Luke and Emily had thought they could destroy me, but they had underestimated just how far I was willing to go to protect what I had built. The storm wasn't over yet, but I was ready for whatever came next. Luke's bravado was completely gone by the time security escorted him back into my office later that afternoon. His once confident stride was now reduced to shuffling feet, his head down like a schoolboy caught cheating on an exam. I motioned for the guards to wait outside and shut the door behind him. Sit, I said, gesturing to the chair in front of my desk. He hesitated, his face pale and his hands fidgeting nervously. Look, Caleb, I can explain. Don't. I cut him off, my voice calm but firm. You've had your chance to explain, and you used it to lie and steal. Now, you're going to listen. I sat down across from him, pulling out the file once again and placing it on the desk between us. I watched as his eyes darted toward it, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed hard. Do you know what happens to people like you, Luke? I asked, leaning forward. People who think they can manipulate others, steal from the company that trusted them, and betray those who helped them get to where they are? He didn't respond, his hands gripping the edge of the chair tightly. They lose everything, I continued. Their reputation, their career, and sometimes even their freedom. Luke's face visibly paled at the word freedom. He shifted uncomfortably, finally finding his voice. Caleb, please, he said, his tone pleading. We can work something out. I'll resign quietly, no fuss. Just don't take this to the authorities. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. You think this is about making a deal? About sweeping this under the rug? Do you have any idea how much damage you've done? Not just to me, but to this entire company? He opened his mouth to respond, but I held up a hand to stop him. Let me spell it out for you, I said, my voice cold. Your embezzlement didn't just line your pockets. It jeopardized projects, cost us clients, and put the livelihoods of hundreds of employees at risk. And on top of all that, you had the audacity to involve Emily. At the mention of her name, Luke's face twisted with a mix of guilt and fear. She didn't know everything, he stammered. I told her it was all above board. I laughed bitterly. You really expect me to believe that? That she had no idea what was going on while the two of you plotted behind my back? His silence was answer enough. I stood, towering over him as I placed my hands on the desk. You and Emily made your choices, Luke, and now you're going to face the consequences. I've already presented the evidence to the board. Your termination is official, and the internal audit will ensure every penny you stole is accounted for. Luke's eyes widened in panic. You don't have to do this, he said, his voice breaking. Please, Caleb, I'll pay it all back. I'll do whatever you want. Just don't ruin me. Ruin you? I repeated, my voice dripping with disdain. You ruined yourself the moment you decided to betray me. I'm just making sure you're held accountable. For a moment, he looked like he was going to argue, but then his shoulders slumped in defeat. What about Emily? He asked quietly. I froze, the mention of her name bringing a fresh wave of anger. What about her? She didn't know about the fraud, he said, though his tone lacked conviction. She just wanted out of the marriage. I clenched my fists, taking a deep breath to steady myself. Emily will get what she deserves, I said, my voice low but resolute. You both will. Luke nodded, his face pale and drawn. What happens now? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I straightened, pulling open the door. Now, you leave this office and wait for the board's decision. Security will escort you out. As Luke stood, I saw the last remnants of his confidence crumble. He turned to leave, but before he stepped out the door, I added, Oh, and Luke? He paused, looking back at me with a mix of fear and desperation. Tell Emily, I said, my voice icy, that she'll be hearing from me very soon. He nodded silently, then disappeared down the hallway with security following close behind. As the door closed behind him, I sat back down at my desk, letting out a slow breath. The fight wasn't over yet, but this was a victory, a small step toward reclaiming what was mine. Emily had betrayed me in ways I never thought possible, but her reckoning was coming. The house was dark when I got home that evening, the only sound the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Emily's car was in the driveway, but the silence told me she was avoiding me, or more likely, plotting her next move. I walked into the dining room, where I'd set the stage for what was about to happen. On the table, I had placed the damning file, along with printed screenshots of the emails between her and Luke. Every lie, every plan, Every betrayal was there in black and white. I didn't have to wait long. Emily walked in, dressed impeccably as always, though her makeup was slightly smudged. She froze when she saw me sitting at the table, her eyes darting to the pile of evidence in front of me. "What's this?" she asked, her voice steady, though her hands clenched the strap of her purse. I leaned back in my chair, gesturing to the papers. "Why don't you take a look? I'm sure you'll recognize it." She hesitated, her eyes narrowing as she stepped closer. Her gaze flicked over the documents, and I saw the exact moment she realized what she was looking at. Her face drained of color, her lips parting slightly as she tried to find something to say. "Caleb," she began, but I held up a hand. "Don't," I said, my voice cold. "Don't insult me by pretending this isn't what it looks like." She dropped her purse onto the floor, sinking into the chair across from me. For a moment, she said nothing, her hands trembling as she reached for the stack of emails. "How long?" I asked, my voice low but firm. "How long has this been going on?" Emily looked up at me, her eyes glistening with tears. I don't know," she stammered. "It just happened." "Don't lie to me, Emily," I said sharply. "I've read every word. I know you and Luke have been plotting this for over a year. The late nights, the work dinners, the sudden need for space. It all makes sense now." She covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she whispered. "I was lonely, Caleb. You were always at work, and I felt invisible." "Invisible?" I repeated, my anger bubbling to the surface. "You felt invisible, so you decided to sleep with my colleague? To conspire against me and steal everything I've worked for? That's your excuse?" Emily looked up at me, her tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice breaking. "I made a mistake." "A mistake?" I said, laughing bitterly. "A mistake is forgetting an anniversary or missing a dinner. What you did was calculated, deliberate. Don't try to minimize it." She reached across the table, but I pulled back, refusing to let her touch me. "Please, Caleb," she pleaded. "We can fix this. We can go to therapy, work through it." "No," I said firmly, cutting her off. "There's no fixing this. You didn't just betray me. You destroyed the life we built together. You chose Luke, and now you can deal with the consequences." Her expression shifted then, the tears giving way to anger. "You think you're perfect?" she snapped. "You think you've been the ideal husband? You're so consumed with your work, your precious company, that you barely noticed I was slipping away." I stood, my fists clenched. "You don't get to play the victim here, Emily. Whatever issues we had in our marriage didn't give you the right to do this. You had a choice, and you chose betrayal." She opened her mouth to argue, but I wasn't finished. "And as for Luke," I continued, my voice hard, "he's done. I've already taken everything from him, and now it's your turn. Don't think for a second that you're walking away from this unscathed." Her eyes widened, and for the first time, I saw real fear. What do you mean?" "I mean the divorce papers are already drafted," I said, my tone icy. "And thanks to the evidence I've collected, you won't see a dime of my money. You wanted to align yourself with a fraud? Fine. But don't come crawling back to me when it all falls apart." Emily stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "You can't do this," she said, her voice trembling. "I made a mistake, Caleb, but you're being cruel." "Cruel?" I said, stepping closer. "Cruel is conspiring with another man to steal from your husband. Cruel is breaking the vows you made on our wedding day." "I'm not being cruel, Emily. I'm being fair." She stared at me, her chest rising and falling as she struggled to respond. Finally, she grabbed her purse and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. I stood there for a long time, the silence of the house pressing down on me. I had confronted her, laid everything bare, but it didn't feel like a victory. Betrayal has a way of hollowing you out, leaving behind a void that even justice can't fill. But as I sat back down at the table, staring at the file that had confirmed everything I feared, I made a promise to myself. I wouldn't let her or Luke define me. This was far from over. The morning after Emily's dramatic exit, I woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. The confrontation had left me emotionally drained, but it also crystallized my next move. Emily and Luke had tried to destroy me, but they had underestimated just how far I was willing to go to take back what was mine. I spent the first hours of the day in my home office, reviewing the evidence I had collected and planning my next steps. The divorce papers were ready, but this wasn't just about ending my marriage. It was about ensuring Emily and Luke paid for every ounce of damage they had inflicted on me, personally and professionally. First, I called my lawyer, Rachel Carson. She had been with me since the beginning of this ordeal, helping me quietly secure my assets and build my case. When she picked up, her tone was sharp and professional. "Morning, Caleb," she said. "How did it go with Emily?" "About as well as expected," I replied. "She's still in denial, but she knows the jig is up. It's time to move forward with the divorce." "Understood," Rachel said. "I'll have the papers filed by the end of the day. Anything else I should know?" "Yes," I said, leaning back in my chair. "It's time to make my case to the board. Luke thinks he's untouchable, but I've got enough evidence to prove otherwise." Rachel chuckled lightly. "I've been waiting for this. Let me know how it goes, and remember, I'm just a call away if you need backup." After hanging up, I sent an email to the board, requesting an emergency meeting. I knew they would take it seriously. The fallout from my earlier revelations had already caused ripples throughout the company. By midday, the meeting was confirmed. The hours leading up to the meeting felt like an eternity. I went over my presentation again and again, fine-tuning every detail to ensure it was airtight. There was no room for error, not when I was up against people as conniving as Emily and Luke. When the time came, I walked into the boardroom with my head held high. The directors were already seated, their expressions a mix of curiosity and concern. Luke, however, was conspicuously absent. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," I began, setting my briefcase on the table. "As you know, recent events have raised serious concerns about the leadership and financial integrity of this company. Today, I intend to address those concerns head-on." I opened the briefcase and pulled out a stack of documents, distributing them to each board member. "What you're holding are detailed records of fraudulent transactions conducted by Luke Foster, the man you appointed as CEO. These records prove that he embezzled millions of dollars from the company using fake invoices and shell accounts to cover his tracks." The room fell silent as the board members reviewed the documents. "But that's not all," I continued. "Included in these records are emails and text messages implicating Emily Lawson, my soon-to-be ex-wife, as an accomplice. Together, they conspired to undermine my leadership, steal from the company, and push me out of my position." One of the senior board members, a no-nonsense woman named Linda, looked up from the papers, her expression grim. "This is damning evidence, Caleb. If what you're saying is true, we have a major scandal on our hands." "It's all true," I said firmly, "and I've already taken steps to ensure accountability. I've frozen the accounts Luke used for his schemes, and I'm filing formal complaints with the authorities. What I need from this board is your support in removing him from his position and reinstating me as CEO." The board erupted into murmurs, some members nodding in agreement while others exchanged uneasy glances. "Before we make any decisions," Linda said, raising her hand for silence, "we need to confirm the authenticity of this evidence. Caleb, are you willing to cooperate fully with an internal investigation?" "Absolutely," I said without hesitation. "I want full transparency. This company deserves better than what Luke and Emily have done to it." The board agreed to proceed with the investigation, but as the meeting adjourned, Linda pulled me aside. "Caleb," she said quietly, "I believe you, but this won't be easy. Luke and Emily won't go down without a fight." "I'm counting on it," I replied, my tone unwavering. "The harder they fight, the more they'll reveal, and I'll be ready." The rest of the day was a whirlwind of activity. The board's decision to launch an investigation sent shockwaves through the company, and by the time I returned to my office, rumors were already spreading. Employees whispered in the hallways, their eyes darting nervously as I walked past. Later that evening, I called Rachel to update her on the day's events. "It's in motion," I said. "The board is investigating, and Luke is officially on notice." "Good," Rachel said. "Just keep your head down and stay focused. You're winning this battle, Caleb, Don't let them rattle you. As I hung up, I felt a surge of determination. Luke and Emily thought they could destroy me, but they had underestimated the lengths I was willing to go to protect what was mine. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about justice, and I was just getting started. The house was quiet when I arrived that evening, a deceptive calm that barely masked the storm brewing beneath the surface. I had expected Emily to run, to stay out late like she had so many times before, but her car was in the driveway. The lights in the living room were on, casting a faint glow into the darkening sky. I entered the house, my footsteps echoing through the silence. Emily was sitting on the couch, her posture tense and her eyes fixed on her phone. When she heard me, she looked up, and for a brief moment, her face betrayed her emotions. Fear, guilt, and defiance all rolled into one. "We need to talk," I said, my voice cold and steady. She set her phone down, folding her hands in her lap. "So talk." I walked over to the dining table, where I had laid out the evidence earlier that day. The file was still there, its presence as damning as the betrayal it contained. I gestured for her to join me, and after a moment of hesitation, she stood and crossed the room. "Care to explain this?" I asked, pointing to the stack of documents. Her eyes flicked over the pages, but she didn't reach for them. "I already told you," she said, her voice defensive. "I made a mistake." "A mistake?" I repeated, my anger simmering just beneath the surface. "This wasn't a mistake, Emily. A mistake is forgetting an anniversary or burning dinner. What you and Luke did was calculated, deliberate, and cruel." She looked away, her jaw tightening. "You weren't exactly innocent, Caleb. You were always working, always putting the company before us. I felt like I didn't matter anymore." I let out a bitter laugh. "So your solution was to sleep with my colleague and conspire to steal my position? That's how you decided to remind me that you mattered?" Her face flushed with anger. "You don't get to act like the victim here. You neglected me, Caleb. You left me alone in this house while you played the big shot CEO. I needed someone who actually saw me. Don't you dare try to justify this," I snapped, my voice rising. "You had a choice, Emily. You could have talked to me, told me how you were feeling. But instead, you chose to betray me in the worst way possible." She crossed her arms, her defiance returning. "And what about you? You're not exactly blameless. You think you're some saint because you work hard? You're just as selfish as I am." I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. "This isn't about me, Emily. It's about what you did. You and Luke thought you could take everything from me. My career, my reputation, my life. But you underestimated me." Her eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about?" I leaned forward, my voice low and deliberate. "Luke is done. The board is investigating, the authorities are involved, and his days of playing the big shot CEO are over. And as for you..." She took a step back, her expression faltering. "What are you going to do?" I straightened, meeting her gaze. "The divorce papers are filed. You'll get nothing. Not the house, not the money, not a single penny of what you tried to steal. You wanted out of this marriage so badly? Congratulations. You're out." Her defiance crumbled, replaced by panic. "You can't do this, Caleb. I made a mistake, but we can fix this. We can go to therapy, work through it." "No," I said firmly, cutting her off. "There's no fixing this. You burned that bridge the moment you and Luke decided to betray me." She opened her mouth to argue, but I wasn't finished. "You think you're the victim here? That I'm the one who ruined this marriage? Look around, Emily. Look at what you've done. This is on you." Tears welled in her eyes, but I felt no sympathy. She had made her bed, and now she would have to lie in it. "I'm leaving," I said, turning toward the door. "I'll stay at a hotel until the papers are finalized. When I come back, I expect you to be gone." "Caleb, wait," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "Please, don't do this." I paused, looking back at her one last time. "You did this, Emily. Not me." Her sobs followed me as I walked out the door, but I didn't look back. The air outside was cold and crisp, a stark contrast to the suffocating tension inside the house. As I drove away, a sense of clarity washed over me. Emily and Luke had tried to destroy me, but they had only succeeded in destroying themselves. This wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one where I rebuilt my life on my terms. The hotel room was quiet, save for the faint hum of the air conditioner. I sat by the window, staring out at the city lights, my thoughts racing. Emily's tears and pleas echoed in my mind, but they didn't sway me. She had made her choices, and now I was making mine. That evening, as I poured myself a drink, I reflected on everything I had done to protect myself, my career, my finances, my sanity. But I realized there was still one move left to make, the move that would ensure neither Emily nor Luke could ever come back from this. I grabbed my laptop and opened the folder containing the mountain of evidence I had collected. It was time to take this beyond the boardroom and the courtroom. It was time to go public. I spent the next several hours crafting an email. It wasn't just a letter. It was a carefully curated dossier of Luke's embezzlement, his fraudulent dealings, and his affair with Emily. Every document, every damning piece of evidence was attached, along with a summary that made it impossible for anyone to ignore. The recipients? Key stakeholders in the company, high-profile clients, and trusted media contacts. If Luke thought he could walk away from this unscathed, he was about to learn just how wrong he was. I hit send, watching as the email disappeared into the ether. There was no going back now. The fallout was swift. By the next morning, my phone was flooded with calls and messages. The media had picked up the story, and it was spreading like wildfire. News outlets were running headlines about the corporate scandal, with Luke's name front and center. Former CEO exposed in multimillion-dollar fraud scandal. One headline read, "Corporate coup gone wrong. The downfall of Luke Foster," said another. Even Emily wasn't spared. The tabloids latched onto the affair, painting her as a manipulative conspirator who had betrayed her husband for greed. It was brutal, but I couldn't bring myself to feel sorry for her. She had made her choices, and now she was paying the price. At the office, the board acted quickly. Luke was officially terminated, his name scrubbed from every corner of the company. The internal audit confirmed everything I had presented, leaving no room for doubt. I was reinstated as CEO by a unanimous vote, with the board publicly apologizing for their role in the fiasco. But I wasn't done yet. Using the company's resources, I filed a civil lawsuit against Luke for damages caused by his fraud. The legal team assured me it was an airtight case, one that would leave him financially ruined. Emily, too, faced consequences. The divorce proceedings moved quickly, thanks to the overwhelming evidence of her betrayal. Rachel, my lawyer, ensured that Emily walked away with nothing. Not a cent of my money, not the house, not even a token of goodwill. By the end of the week, Luke was in handcuffs, his smug grin replaced with a look of utter defeat. The media captured every moment as he was led out of his apartment, the weight of his actions finally catching up to him. Emily disappeared from public view, her once polished image shattered. Mutual friends who had once sung her praises now distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with the scandal. As for me, I felt a sense of closure I hadn't thought possible. Watching Luke and Emily face the consequences of their actions was satisfying, yes, but it was more than that. It was a reminder that no matter how much someone tries to tear you down, resilience and determination can rebuild even the most shattered lives. One evening, after everything had settled, I stood in my newly renovated office, gazing out at the city skyline. The company was thriving, my name cleared, and my future brighter than it had been in years. Rachel called as I sat at my desk. "Congratulations, Caleb," she said. "You've done it." "Thank you, Rachel," I replied, my voice steady. "I couldn't have done it without you." "You've earned every bit of this," she said. "Now go enjoy it." I hung up, a small smile playing on my lips. For the first time in a long time, I felt truly free. Emily and Luke had tried to destroy me, but in the end, their betrayal had only made me stronger. This wasn't just a victory, it was a new beginning. The crisp morning air filled the balcony of my penthouse, overlooking the city that had seen me at my lowest and now witnessed my resurgence. The chaos and betrayal were behind me, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I could breathe deeply without the weight of anger or heartbreak dragging me down. The company was flourishing under my leadership. The scandal had shaken us, but it also served as a wake-up call. With Luke and his toxic influence gone, my team and I worked tirelessly to rebuild trust with our clients and investors. Projects that had been neglected under his tenure were thriving again, and morale among employees had never been higher. But the office wasn't my only focus anymore. Life had taken on a new meaning. I had reconnected with old friends, people I had lost touch with while I was drowning in work and a loveless marriage. These weren't superficial relationships. They were genuine, built on mutual respect and shared history. For the first time in years, I felt part of a community that cared about me for who I was, not for what I could offer. Then there was Rachel. She had been more than just my lawyer through this ordeal. She had become my confidant, my support system, and, eventually, my partner. It started with late-night conversations about life and justice, moments of laughter breaking through the tension of court battles and board meetings. One evening, after a particularly long day, I invited her to dinner. It wasn't planned or rehearsed. I just wanted her company outside the confines of our professional roles. She agreed, and that night, over wine and laughter, something shifted between us. Rachel was nothing like Emily. She was honest, grounded, and unapologetically herself. Being with her felt easy, natural, like finding a missing piece I hadn't known I needed. Months turned into a year, and Rachel and I built a life together. She helped me navigate the aftermath of the betrayal, not by shielding me from it, but by reminding me of my strength. One afternoon, as we sat in her favorite cafe, she reached across the table and took my hand. "You've come so far, Caleb," she said, her eyes filled with warmth. "You're not the same man you were when all of this started." I smiled, squeezing her hand gently. "That's because of you," I said. "You helped me see that there's more to life than just surviving." Together, we started making plans for the future, traveling to places we'd always dreamed of, expanding the charitable initiatives I'd started through the company, and even buying a house outside the city where we could escape the noise when we needed to. Emily, as far as I knew, had faded into obscurity. She tried reaching out once, a desperate email begging for forgiveness, but I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. Luke, on the other hand, was serving a lengthy prison sentence, his name synonymous with disgrace. Their betrayals no longer haunted me. If anything, they had become the catalyst for my transformation. I had taken what could have destroyed me and used it as fuel to rebuild my life, stronger and more purposeful than before. On the anniversary of my reinstatement as CEO, I hosted a small gathering at the company. Employees and partners mingled, celebrating not just our achievements but the resilience that had brought us here. During my speech, I looked out at the crowd and said, "This past year has taught me that challenges are opportunities in disguise. What matters isn't how we fall, it's how we rise." The room erupted into applause, and I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the people who had stood by me and for the journey that had brought me to this point. That night, Rachel and I returned to the penthouse, the city lights twinkling below us. We stood on the balcony, her head resting on my shoulder as we gazed out at the world we had built together. "Do you regret any of it?" she asked softly. I thought about her question, the betrayals, the pain, the struggle to reclaim what was mine. "No," I said after a moment, "because it led me here." She smiled, leaning up to kiss me gently. "Here is a good place to be." And she was right. I had reclaimed my life, built something better from the ashes of what had been destroyed. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. With Rachel by my side and a future filled with promise, I knew one thing for certain. I was finally free.